How's it going, everybody? My name is Lee Woodmansee, and I'm the campus minister here at the Baptist Collegiate Ministry at the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith. Right now, you are joining us in the middle of Session 5, our video that we're going to be doing for our Women Through the Bible series. And we're going to be talking about Ruth today. So if you haven't actually read all of the book of Ruth, which is only 4 chapters in the Old Testament, we want you to go ahead and pause this video and then come back around to us after you read that, because we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about pretty much all 4 of those chapters. We're not going to be able to skip around across those 4 chapters and skip anything because it's all important. So make sure you have read Ruth, and then we will be good to go. Come back to this video. I'm excited about what we're going to be talking about today, because Ruth, I think, is one of those fascinating characters in the Old Testament that really gets us to a point where we understand what purpose narrative serves in the scripture. And so we're going to be talking about that today. And I keep saying we because I am not speaking just to the camera and it's just me. I am actually joined by one of my favorite former students, Crystal Williams. Crystal, how about you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Crystal Williams. I currently lead worship at the BCM. I am a Southern Baptist Theological Seminary student.
Yes, you are the Southern Baptist.
Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And yeah, I do student ministry at my church, so I'm just kind of involved in a lot of different areas of ministry.
Yeah, and when I say that Crystal is one of my favorite former students, that's actually a fact. Crystal, you served on our leadership team for how many years? 3? Three. And you've led worship in some capacity, either being on the stage, playing backing keys or vocals, or leading outright for 3.5, 4 years, something like that.
I think it's close
something
to
like
4.
that. So, I mean, Crystal is heavily involved in things that we have here at the BCM. In fact, you have heard her on some of our podcasts that we've had with the link over the summer whenever we were talking about spiritual disciplines. So you've heard her more than once. So this is not unfamiliar territory for you to be in front of a microphone.
No,
Maybe in front of camera a little bit, but not necessarily anything else. Right. So, well, with that being said, all those accolades out of your way, why are we talking about Ruth? What's the deal?
So if it's in the Bible, it's worth learning. But even times like this where we get more of a vague storyline, there's still plenty of things that we can learn from that. And so even if this is not an easier text to read and get a meaning out of, it still has value. And there's still plenty of things we can learn from this.
Gotcha. So what is it that you want to tell us? Like, can you recap the narrative of Ruth for us? All 4 chapters.
Okay. 4 chapters, no big deal. So there is a famine in a land, and these 3 women, Naomi, and then Orpah, is that how you say it?
Orpah, yeah.
Orpah. And
Not
then,
Oprah.
Not Oprah.
Not Oprah.
And then Ruth, each of them lose their husbands. So we don't get a lot of story on how they lost their husbands. It just opens up the book. All 3 of them lost their husbands.
And then they're in the land of Moab, right?
Yes.
Okay.
In the land of Moab. And so they are immediately like introduced as these people that have just survived a great tragedy. And so Naomi is talking about her 2 daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah. Mm-hmm. And so she says, okay, well, since your husband's died, you're still pretty young, like, go find new husbands. And Orpah says, okay, I'm going to go return to my family. And Ruth says, Naomi, you are my family. Like, mm-hmm. You're it. And so Naomi says, no, like, you go. And Orpah's like, okay, I'm going. And Ruth is like, yeah, no. Like, you're my family. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I stay. Like, I will stay with you. But what we see throughout this whole book is they have different responses to the tragedy that's happened. So Ruth is taking this opportunity to see how God is going to provide for her. And we see that in contrast to Naomi, who we see over and over again. She believes that God has dealt very bitterly with her in this. She blames God for the death of her husband and
her sons.
Mm-hmm. And so she just starts off with saying, this is God's fault. God's dealt with me bitterly. And we see that many times, but the first time is in chapter 1 and in verse 13. And so she's having this conversation with them saying, like, go find new husbands. And then she says, "No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." So we see immediately that there's different reactions to the things that are going on. So then we see how Ruth and Naomi are now living together, and they're trying to find a way to provide for themselves. So Ruth obviously kind of looks at it from the perspective of, well, God's going to help us. God's going to somehow make this work. And Naomi says, wait a second, no, like, if we're going to do something, it's going to be our doing it. So then Naomi, in her moment of bitterness, actually changes her name to Mara. Mm-hmm. So Naomi, meaning pleasant, she changes her own name, which is interesting in the Bible because most of the time it's God changing names.
Right.
But she takes it upon herself to change her name to Mara, which means bitter. So then Naomi...
Which is just a nod to how she's,
yes.
Responding.
Yes, how she feels. And one thing we don't see throughout this book is really the voice of God. We don't see God actively saying, like, this is the situation, like, I have taken your husband from you. We don't see any clarification from God of, this is why I'm doing these things. And so, understandably for Naomi, she's like, okay, where are you, God? Like, if you're not talking to me, then you've dealt with me bitterly. So anyway, continuing, then Naomi realizes that she's got some relatives nearby, and she tells Ruth, okay, go to their field and pick up anything they drop, which was common practice back then for women to go behind, and whatever they dropped, women pick up, bring back to their families.
That technical term being gleaning.
Yes. So not a weird thing. So that was totally common back then. But we see that the person that owns this field, his name is Boaz, and he's described as someone who is upright, he's righteous, he is worthy. The phrase that gets used a lot is kinsman redeemer. So what that would mean is if someone lost their husband, then someone else in the family would step in and make sure that that person wouldn't lose their inheritance. So, so he owns this field, and Naomi sends Ruth to this field. And so Boaz notices, like, hey, there's a new woman in our field. And so he says, I don't know who she is. Someone find out and report back. So one of his servants finds out who she is, comes back and says, hey, this is Naomi's daughter-in-law, Ruth. And he goes, okay, I know Naomi. She's in my family. And so he then commands his servants, like, protect her.
Make sure nothing happens to her.
Make sure nothing happens to her. Make sure nobody's going to assault her in any way. Like, make sure no one touches her. And so then she gets enough, I think it's barley, isn't it?
Yeah.
Barley. And so then Ruth gathers all this barley, and she comes back to Naomi, and Naomi is just amazed. She's like, how in the world did you get this much? Like, no one comes back with this much. And so Ruth says, like, I went to the field.
This cat named Boaz.
This guy named Boaz, like, made sure that no one bothered me and everything was fine. And so Naomi, later on in chapter 2, this is the person who said God's dealt bitterly. And she kind of changes her tune a little bit. She goes back and forth. And so she says, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. So, like, praise be to God that he's provided for you. But God hasn't provided for me because I'm still a little bitter.
Despite the fact the food's right in front of both of us.
Yes.
Right.
And so then Naomi, who is very grateful for this food, then turns and is like, you know what? We could actually make this a sweeter deal. So let's trick him into marrying you so that we really solidify this. And so what we see in chapter 3 is Naomi is basically setting Ruth up to look like a prostitute. And so she is saying, make sure after he goes to the threshing floor where he's sifting out, the seeds from what's good to eat, you lay at his feet. And so she's setting Ruth up to look very questionable and like she's got questionable morals in hopes that Boaz will kind of like marry her quickly and kind of like diffuse any kind of gossip or anything that might look bad. And so Ruth is like, well, you're my mother-in-law, like, I'm going to obey you out of respect and honor. But then whenever Ruth goes in to do this, Ruth kind of takes a different approach and she lays at his feet. So she does obey, but she does it in a way that Boaz obviously knows, like, she's not doing anything. And so in chapter 3, we see Boaz, whenever he realizes there's a girl at the end of my bed, he obviously says, like, who are you? Like, I didn't do anything. You didn't do anything. You're not supposed to be here, but let's just make sure nobody did anything questionable here. And so then he said, okay, since you've done the respectable thing here, I'm going to honor that. And because you have done this in the best way you possibly could, I'm going to redeem you. But before I can redeem you, there's someone that's closer in line. So I don't know all the technicalities of...
Yeah, there was somebody who was more closely related in the family. They had first dibs.
Yeah. So he says, I'll give you these 6 measures of barley, which is basically like a dowry, like, kind of like a bride price. And it would basically kind of confirm to Naomi, like, yeah, I plan on marrying her. Like, here's this kind of trade.
This is for real, yeah.
This is for real. And so then Boaz is like, okay, I'm going to meet with the guy that's closer that has the first dibs. I'm going to do it with plenty of witnesses so that nothing shady happens. And so this guy that's the closer relative, he's like, okay, like, yeah, that sounds like a good deal. And he's like, but you get Ruth. And he's like, wait a second.
The Moabite.
The Moabite. He's like, that's not something I want. And so he says, okay, then I'll redeem her. And so then they get married. And so then Ruth has a kid. And then after Naomi has already told Ruth, like, go in there, lay at his feet, that's the last we really hear of Naomi. Then we hear people talk to Naomi, but we don't hear Naomi directly speak after that. So then Ruth has a son, and all the other women around them go to Naomi and say, like, can you not see how God has provided for you in this? Can you not see how God has turned all of your suffering, all of your, your despair of losing your husband and turned it for something good? And so they say, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. And so then it talks about he'll be a nourisher of your old age. Like, this is now your pride and joy of you have a grandson now. And then it goes on to say that this grandson is going to be the father of Jesse, who is the father of David. And if you're unfamiliar with the Old Testament, David ends up being a very prominent character. He ends up being the king of Israel. So runs away from Saul for years and years and years, because Saul is literally a maniac who just wants him dead. Yeah. But this is the same David that fought Goliath, same one that killed the lion, like
sets up the monarchy in all of Israel. Yep.
Yes, like he's a very important person. So yeah, this thing that happened out of tragedy and of these women losing their husbands, which I'm sure affected them for who knows how long, forever really, turns out to be the very thing that God uses to really establish Israel for centuries. Mm-hmm. So it's neat to see how something that Naomi referred to as a bitter thing ended up being not only for her good, but for the good of an entire nation for centuries.
Right, and it wasn't because of her obedience necessarily. It was through her direction of the one who was obedient and the one who was compliant and all these things from her mother-in-law, who is the one we expected to not be, right?
Yes.
She's the Moabite. I think there's just a lot of detail that we can just gloss right over because Ruth is only 4 chapters, but there's like a lot of really great symmetry. I don't know if you picked up on that or if any of y'all who read this, but in chapter 1 and 2, or excuse me, 1 and 4, there's this great tragedy and also loyalty and rejoicing. Those themes kind of come back over and over. But in the middle chapters 2 and 3, there's this symmetrical, like, plan that there is a plan that is made. Go to the threshing floor, go sit at Boaz's feet. And in the middle, there is the encounter with Boaz. And at the end, you have Naomi and Ruth both rejoicing. So, like, even though there's only 4 chapters, it is absolutely packed with meaning by the way it's designed, by the words that are used. It's really important for us to not miss all that. Is there anything else that you want to say about this is what we need to take away from Ruth as a whole before we start answering some specific questions about Ruth herself?
One thing just to pay attention to as you're reading is definitely the responses from each person, how they respond to both the tragedy and how they respond to good things happening. So, yeah.
And I think that includes looking at Boaz as well.
Yes.
So it's not just Naomi and Ruth, the titular character here, but also Boaz, who's really critical. All right, so we've kind of just talked around this. Let's be really specific. What are some of the characteristics of Ruth that we see being revealed in this narrative?
Well, one of the phrases that gets repeated often is that Ruth has found favor. This is kind of significant because this is also a phrase that's used in Esther a lot. And so the idea of finding favor, of someone taking care of them because they have found favor, is something that's repeated. As of things that Ruth says and the way she's described, is she's constantly described as the Moabite, as the outsider, as the one that no one cares about, kind of the one that's like, she doesn't belong here, but, I guess I'll take care of her.
And according to lineage, she doesn't.
Right.
Absolutely not, right?
So, but then doesn't she end up getting mentioned in Jesus's lineage?
Yes, one of the very few women. There's Ruth.
So, the fact that she has found favor both with Boaz and it also says with the Lord. So that's a repeated idea. And then she is the other that people don't necessarily pay much attention to.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot that we could learn just by looking at Ruth as a whole. I think you can look at places like just her loyalty to Naomi just as a whole, where at the very opening chapter, Naomi is dismissing Orpah, but Ruth refuses to go. She says, no, where you go, I go. Where you stay, I stay. Your God will become my God. Your people, my people. And I think that's chapter 1, verse 16. That's one of the clear callings of this is who Ruth is. And then later in chapter 2, verse 11, Boaz even mentions this is the one who is with Naomi. She is doing the things that Naomi has told her. I think there's just this loyalty that is really evident all the way through the book. And that loyalty is not just with Ruth to Naomi, it's also in Boaz. So how do you see Boaz being loyal to his family inheritance? How do you see Boaz being a loyal and faithful Israelite through this context? Does that stick out to you?
Yes. So Boaz, we can see just very easily. He's very faithful and consistent in who he says he is and who other people say he is. So obviously he's loyal to the God, like Jesus, obviously, but Jesus hasn't come, so that's so Boaz makes it clear, I am obeying God in doing these things. So we can see that in how in chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, how Boaz talks to his servants. And it's immediately this good morning blessing of the Lord be with you during your work today. And the servants immediately respond the Lord be with you too. That's just kind of a precedent he sets. So I think his loyalty to God is significant, and then his loyalty and consistency in who he is as a person and how that plays out in his daily life
Yeah.
is significant.
And I think you can see that even at the very opening line of chapter 2, verse 1, when he says that now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, this cat named Boaz, but he is first described as a relative, setting up the dichotomy of in Hebrew is the Gaal, the one who redeems. He is the one who is going to be the kinsman redeemer. But how he's then described is not just as a relative, but as a worthy man. And that phrase can get translated as like a rich man, but we know that's probably not how it's meant here, because that exact same Hebrew phrase of not Hebrew man or worthy, or excuse me, a worthy man, but of a worthy woman is used of Ruth. And we wouldn't say Ruth was wealthy. So like Boaz is even being described as like a loyal Israelite, even being loyal to the laws, commandments to let people glean on the outside edges of your field, right? And he goes even further in protecting them. What other characteristics of Ruth do we see coming out in this narrative that are beneficial for us to see right out the gate?
Well, I think we highlighted this earlier, but Ruth as a Moabite suddenly becoming faithful and loyal to God. Like, she's just lost everything. She doesn't know where else to turn, but she knows that God somehow provided for her. And so now she sees, like, if this is Naomi's God and this is going to be my God, like, I'm going all in.
Mm-hmm.
So that means following the laws that were at this point. And so we see that Ruth immediately kind of makes that change and says, this is what I believe now, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, and we don't get to see that part of the narrative, which is a little frustrating on my end. Like, I want to know more detail of, like, okay, what happened in that time in Moab? What were the conversations like with Orpah? But we just don't get to see that. But there clearly is something that has caused her to trust in God. Now, Naomi, not so much. Like, we don't see her. But one thing that really sticks out to me is just kind of this series as we've walked along. In the very first session, Clay Kibler talked about how God delights in reversals. And man, in the book of Ruth, the greatest reversal is the one who should have been loyal, Naomi, isn't. And the one who has every reason not to be, Ruth, is. And there's just this great faith that's demonstrated through there. Any other characteristics of Ruth that you want to throw out there for us to make sure that we highlight?
Not that I can think of.
I think one of the ones that sticks out to me is just how hardworking she is. Like in chapter 2, Boaz mentions that she's been out there this whole time from sun up to sundown. Later at the end of the chapter, we see that the narrator kind of says that that Ruth had done this for the period of several months during the entire harvest time. She had been out there every single day, and Boaz just notices that she works hard and her humility. Like, she humbly is obedient to Naomi, and even in the story you've alluded to with what happens in chapter 3, which is kind of shady, we'll talk about that in a second, like, she goes above and beyond to make sure that her character is not impinged by that. Like, there's great humility there, and that there's not this pride welling up in her that says, no, I got to protect myself. So let's actually talk about that weird narrative, because you have painted one picture of how this narrative goes out, with Naomi kind of putting Ruth into a weird situation that might be kind of shady. I have read that. I have believed that for a long time. I'm more convinced of something that's a little bit different, but at the end of the day, it still comes around to the same thing, that when it talks about Naomi taking off her clothes, it's more talking about like her widow's robes, like something that would mark her as a woman who is grieving. Whereas when she goes and sits at Boaz's feet, she's now wearing something that makes herself more available. Now, what that means is more provocative? Is she just put something sexy on? Like, I don't know. And I don't necessarily think that was her intent, because as you did lay out, she makes sure that there's like a clear separation of what's going on. The only problem with that entire painting of the picture that way is the way that Boaz kind of sends her off in the morning before anyone else is up. That's just kind of weird. At the end of the day, I don't know how to handle that. So how do you resolve that tension of this narrative of like, man, this seems like it could be kind of hard for us to deal with, but like, clearly Ruth comes out the other side smelling like roses. So like, what are we supposed to do with that?
Well, I think in Boaz's response to the situation, I think that's kind of key.
Yeah.
So Boaz, we've already talked about how consistent he is in his character. So when he responds in chapter 3, pretty much from 8 on, So Ruth's laid down, and it says, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. The fact that he's startled shows like this is outside of the norm for him. This is outside of what he normally does. And this is obviously something that he didn't intend to happen.
Right. And he just wakes up and there she is.
There she is.
Now, yeah.
And so then he says, who are you? Obvious question because it's probably dark.
Yeah,
so it's probably
right.
like,
There in verse 9, yeah.
Who is this chick that's at my feet? And then she says, I'm Ruth, your servant. I am not someone for you to take advantage of. I'm not someone that's about to do anything questionable. You've seen me work. You've seen
For these past months.
For these past months. You know who I am. You know my character. I am your servant. So even Ruth makes it very clear of like, nothing questionable going on here. And then she said, spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. So I am here looking for protection and provision. That's it.
And you've already been providing that. At the end of chapter 2, like Naomi even remarks like, hey, what you're doing is dangerous. You know that, right? And she says, thank God that Boaz has protected you. And so she is just, again, even here in chapter 3 with the conversation with Boaz saying, we've already been down this road. And so then Boaz asks, okay, what do you want me to do? And it's real simple at that point.
So then she kind of goes into, will you redeem me? And he kind of already picks up on this just by how she's handled this. And so then is where we see Ruth described again in verse 11 as, you are a worthy woman.
Same exact phrase, basically, from earlier in chapter 2, verse 1 for Boaz.
So your character hasn't changed in this situation. You're still who you've said you are. You've shown that you are. And now I know you're looking for a redeemer, so let's start that process.
Right.
So then it says, remain tonight and in the morning. If he will redeem you, good, let him do so. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So then it's the whole, it's midnight-ish. If you go out now, bad things are probably going to happen.
Right.
So I'm just going to provide for you, still in the distance, nothing weird going on way. But then in the morning, leave so that no one's like,
right.
Where'd this person
so
come
that
from?
he doesn't impinge on her character as well.
Right.
Right.
So he's not the only one with a high stake here of his character being questioned. It's also her character being questioned. And everyone else probably would have known like what this looked like. And so the fact that he's even trying to protect her reputation says something about him too. Like even in this, he's being consistent with his character.
Gotcha.
And so, yeah, that's when he's like, okay, well, if we're going to start this process, like obviously you need to leave to protect your character, protect my character. But let me, before you go, confirm my intentions and give you a dowry.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's just really key for us to understand about how this whole conversation happens with this this other redeemer, this other closer relative, I think it bears mention of like, why is it that after that Boaz mentions to this cat, hey, you're going to have to marry Ruth as well. Well, the guy immediately is like, no, not so much. Why is that in your mind? Is it because he doesn't know her, or like what's going on there?
Well, for most people, that would mean, it says in let me look at what verse 5, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. And then this closer redeemer says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So take the redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. His fear is that if he has sons with someone else, then he's got to split his inheritance that he's giving to his sons, and that would mean his sons get less, and there's just this whole mess there that he just didn't want to deal with.
Yeah. And I think one other element that kind of hides in the background there that's not explicitly told to us because it's narrative, and we've just got to look a little bit closer at the actual way that the narrative shakes out, is as soon as he mentions Ruth, the Moabite, the guy's out. But Boaz doesn't have any problem with her being the Moabite. Why? Why does he not have a problem? What has her character shown all along? She has been loyal to Naomi. She has been loyal to God. Like, she has made this declaration. Now, I'm sure he is not aware of what was said back in chapter 1, verse 16 between Naomi and Ruth while they were still in Moab. But like, he has seen her work these several months and her character. And so he's not concerned with that because he understands who she really is. And so Boaz doesn't have a problem with this, right? And I think that's just one of those details that kind of skates right by that maybe we would do well to kind of look at a little bit closer. So this is where we want to get to like the real meat and potatoes of it, as far as like hammer home some points for us, Crystal. What are we supposed to learn about Ruth, and what are we supposed to learn about God in this narrative?
Well, for one, we mentioned pretty early on that we never hear God's direct voice in this. And so sometimes when, obviously, we are all going to go through tragedy at some point in our lives. It's inevitable. Like, Jesus never told us it was going to be easy. In fact, he kind of promised, like, it's going to be hard. Like, you know, make sure this is really what you want to do, because it's not going to be easy. And so kind of how we deal with tragedy and how we see God working in it is definitely something that we should be aware of. And it's true that in this, we don't see God's direct voice, but we hear a lot of people mention God or what God's doing or how God's providing. And I think that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, of sometimes when we go through tragedy, we don't directly hear God. But that doesn't mean that God isn't working.
Right. It's not that he's not active. It just might be not visible in his activity to you. Yeah. So whenever we think about what God is doing for us in that regard, what was the thing that, if you had to nail it down in the narrative of Ruth, what did God do for Naomi and what did he do for Ruth?
Provide in the way of a redeemer. So obviously he provided for their basic needs of like food, but more than that, he provided a way to continue a family, which was obviously very important to people back then. If you didn't have family, like, you were considered to be someone of lesser worth. You wouldn't have as much honor to your name. So God provides not only like their most basic needs, but also their long-term needs.
Yeah, and we saw that with a couple sessions ago with Leah and Rachel, and how they are desperate for children, and their lineage is preserved, but also like that they're desperate for confirmation that they are worthy, right? And I mean, I don't know if we can necessarily read all that into Ruth necessarily, but with Naomi, we kind of see that laying in the background as well, right? But broaden the scope for us. You mentioned it just a hair earlier, but God doesn't just provide for their physical needs. He provides for their inheritance and their prosperity moving forward, but he also goes a step further than that for the nation, right? How does God work on a much larger scale in that regard as we see Ruth in the narrative unfold?
So once Boaz and Ruth get married, they have a son. That son ends up being the grandfather to David. So David literally sets up the kingdom of Israel. And so I think when we go through trials or tragedy, we also need to keep in mind that God can do more in our single moment than we could ever realize in our entire lifetime. I am sure Naomi never thought like, oh, you know, like several grandsons from now, I'm going to have a king in the family. Like, that's probably something Naomi never lived to see, and she never even thought of. But yet, God used this horrible tragedy of her losing her husband to bring about something that affected nations, that affects history even now. So God can do so much more with a single tiny moment than what we ever realize.
Gotcha. And just to make this really clear contextually, kind of where we are, session 5 is immediately following session 4, where we talked about Deborah, one of the judges, right? Because Ruth and Naomi and Boaz are living through the time of the judges. There is no king in Israel. And so when you say that there's no way she could have imagined a couple grandsons from now that there would be a king in the family, yeah, because there were no kings. Israel had no king. But we fast forward over into the New Testament, and we see Jesus himself being called son of David, right? Draw the connection there. Like, why, not just a physical, lineage, way of thinking about this. How else do we see Jesus fulfilling this role that Boaz does, that eventually with David? Like, what do we see that's going on there being typified through these characters?
So a lot of people, whenever we read in 1st and 2nd Samuel how people were desperate for a king, and so people cried out to God, we want a king, God, we want a king, and God's like, I told you, the answer's no, but since you were so persistent about it, here's a horrible king for you.
Give you what you want.
Give you what you want. This guy's going to ruin the country, but you want it, so here we go. So then God gives them Saul, and Saul starts out okay, but then he ends up being
real bad real quick.
Real quick. Ends up literally, I don't remember what the phrase is, but essentially loses his mind. And so just he hunts down David because people are trying to find another king to kind of replace him.
And he had been anointed at this point. David has. He is going to be the king.
He is going to be the king. It's already kind of set in stone. But Saul dislikes that greatly. And so he decides, well, if this guy is going to be the one to replace me, I'll just kill him so he can't. And so we see David, running into the wilderness and hiding in caves. And we see him then turning around and trying to soothe Saul with music. And so it's this back and forth of David going, well, am I a king? Am I not? Like, when do I actually become king? Because this guy is trying to hunt me down. So that's a whole other thing. But basically then David takes the role of kind of redeeming the kingdom.
Yeah.
And just like Boaz with redeeming Ruth and kind of providing in that instance, David starts providing for the kingdom and really kind of getting things together to last a long time. So David kind of takes control and says, like a temple, we need one of those. Like, we need one that's actually going to...
And not just a tent.
Not just a tent that's out in the woods, like an actual physical place. So David kind of spearheads that. And so when we talk about Jesus in relation to David, David was a king, which we read in Isaiah that Jesus is going to be the king. So they are alike in that way, but they also have the job of like redeeming whole nations.
Right.
So, and not just when we talk about David, it's obviously like provision for the kingdom and in that sense, and providing a place of worship. But then in Jesus's sense, he provides for us in a much better way. So when we talk about Jesus being the better king,
right,
then that's kind of where that comes into play.
Right. And I don't want to make light of this, but to say that, Boaz is the redeemer, if that word is just a little too foreign for us, then rescuer. He's the one who rescues. What does David do for the nation? He rescues the nation from, this unsatisfactory king, to say it that way, to put it mildly, right? But what does Jesus rescue us from? He rescues us from eternal death. He rescues us from our depravity and our sin. And all of that, to wrap it back around to why it's important for us, is that it all starts in our narrative with this Moabite, this person that has no claim to be rightly thought of as being someone who the rescuer is going to come from. They've got no role, no right to claim that. And this is where I go back to what Clay said, is that God delights in reversals. And so if that's something that we struggle with thinking that we're just in a situation that we can't fix, well, God delights in reversals with you as well, and redeeming and rescuing us as well. I think that's really prescient for us. So, Crystal, before we head out of here, any final thoughts, comments, concerns, applications, things you want to throw out here about Ruth? What would be your parting shot for us?
Oh, goodness. So there's a lot of things that I could say. For one, I think it's important for guys to realize, as Christian men, you have a responsibility to protect and guard your sisters in Christ. Just like Boaz, guard their purity as much as you can. That's kind of weird in a brother-sister kind of way. But if it's, I know the times we've gone on mission trips, Lee, you've been very adamant of guys, you will protect these girls at whatever cost. So I think just that kind of protectiveness of if you're my sister in Christ, I'm going to protect you. I think that's something that is kind of lacking,
Yeah.
honestly. And I think that guys could do better at that.
Yeah, so in session 1, Clay really clearly talked about that, guys, you need to understand that women are not possessions to have. They are people to protect. In the same way that we would protect someone who is who's not a sister or someone that we might even consider weak. That's not the issue. It's that they are deserving of our protection. That's how God has designed men in that role. Well, if God has designed men in that role, that doesn't mean that women are just necessarily of less value. Like, no. They are of a different value. And we see that in Ruth. That, like, did she need protection? Yes. But she demonstrates faithfulness and humility and loyalty all the way through this. And that's to be commended. Mm-hmm. Rock on. Final thoughts.
Well, I haven't said this phrase in a while, but if the gospel is only good for good people, then it's not good.
Say it again.
If the gospel is only good for good people, then it's not good.
What do you mean by that?
If the gospel is only for the people that are faithful and consistent in what they believe and who they are, if the gospel is only for those people, then it's not good. You're trying to reach a standard that's unrealistic. The gospel is just as much for people like Naomi, who believe that God's dealt bitterly with them, as it is for people like Ruth, who have wholeheartedly believed in what God's doing. Mm-hmm. So when we think about the different ways people react to things like this of God's provision, like, God's provision isn't just for specific people.
Right.
It's not just for people that, don't cuss or, like, go to church every Sunday. It's not just for those people. It's for everyone. So it's just as much for people like Naomi as it is for Ruth.
Rock on. I like that. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up where we are right now. There's plenty more that we could talk about. There's going to be a lot of discussion questions that are going to be down below in the video description. So make sure you hang around here as I recap the video and kind of bring us to a point of looking at one or two more clear thoughts of discussion questions for us. But Crystal, thank you for being here. I am thankful that you are leading in the way that you are with our worship and that you have with our student leaders and with this right here. So I thank you for your perspective.
Thanks for letting me.
Rock on. Well, guys, like I said, I am glad that you have joined us. I'm glad that y'all have been here. Make sure you hang around, catch the outro, and if you got any questions, you know how to get a hold of us, guys. Hey guys, I want to just wrap up this video. I'm especially thankful for Crystal and the way that she has brought some clarity to the story from Ruth. And so I just want to direct your attention to all the discussion questions we have down below in the video description. There's really only two that I really want to draw your attention to, and that's the 7th and the 9th set of questions that I have there. Here's the 7th question. I just want to draw quick attention to it. When we think about how God has provided for us, I think that we would all recommend acknowledging that God is good for having provided in those ways. But I think we would also be honest if we also said, but the way that he provided or exactly what he provided, maybe we would have chosen otherwise if we had the option. I want you guys to discuss that and think about what it means to stand in light of God's provision and how to deal with that in a square and honest way while also being able to say, thank you, God, for the way that you have provided. The last question I want you to focus in on is the 9th one, the last one that we have. I think that this is really playing off of that last phrase that Crystal talked about, that if the gospel isn't for everyone, then it's not good. Here's the question. Can there be ways in which we think that the gospel is only for a certain subset of people and that others are excluded? If we think that way, what dangers lie in actually thinking and conceiving of the world in that way? I want you guys to discuss that and actually give some attention to that, because I feel like there's some fruitful conversation that you can have around that topic. Well, guys, I love you. I want you to know that you can always reach out and get a hold of us for anything that you need. Like we always do, I want to end with our benediction of sorts, and that's with the simple phrase of do good and don't sin.